Ideology is stupid for those of us who have no power. It doesn't matter what we would do if we did. We don't. Seizing power, taking out the idiotic, incompetent, greedy, evil, and stupid people who are ruining our lives is what matters. One of the things when I was touring that book, people at my appearances...
You were touring that book?
I toured that book. People who appeared and they'd say, they'd come and they'd say, yeah, but you're advocating violence. And I was like, no, I'm advocating an end to violence that may require some violence in order to effect, only in part. Make no mistake, there's plenty of violence right now. I mean, every time someone's evicted from their home because they can't pay their rent, that's violence. Making people homeless is violence. Depriving people of health care is violence. Drones are violence. Bombings are violence. Police shootings of black people is violence. I hate to say it, but if you're like us and we're privileged white people, then of course it doesn't affect us very directly, very often. Sometimes.
This is Phantom Hampton, stories from where the rest of us live. Phantom Hampton is a podcast about the 99% living in the 1% world of the Hamptons. These are stories you might not think are happening out here on the eastern tip of Long Island. This week's episode is Pissed Off and Wide Awake. Ted Rall's case for Marxism in the Hamptons. We talk about Marxism, we talk about assholes, we talk about ISIS, we talk about comics and Trump and capitalism. It's a good episode. You can read the story on the East End Beacon website and listen to it here. Soon after 45 was elected, my experiment with so-called alt-right Christian radio began. I wondered if their media would change my brain. I wondered if I might grow a small pair of horns. At the very least, I thought I might get another perspective. After 30 years of listening to NPR, I honestly couldn't tell where NPR stories ended and my brain began. At first, it was terribly exciting to switch stations and listen to all the right-wing vitriol. They had opinions and were not afraid to share them. It was amazing to see us as a cliché after seeing them as a cliché for so long. But I could only take their violent and misshapen personality disorders for so long before I had to change the channel back. One thing I learned is that I had probably been duped by the left. Duped to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, even the sociopaths. I wondered, had 30 years of listening to NPR changed my brain into a lazy liberal sponge that couldn't accept the reality of pure evil? There is an antidote to all this free-floating angst. People like Ted Rall exist. He's a political cartoonist, a graphic novelist, a journalist, a proud Marxist and intellectual, an all-around agitator. It is his mission to teeter on every edge, pushing the boundaries of what this culture and other cultures can bear to hear about themselves. He's radicalized. Sometimes it gets him in trouble with the alt-right, the regular right, the soft left, and of course, ISIS. Few people besides the Pope dare to say the word revolution these days. Rall doesn't mince words when he says that revolution is the quest for happiness, and that it's worth throwing out the whole political system and starting from scratch. In his wonderful book, The Anti-American Manifesto, he says that we need to define evil and then point to those doing it. Quote, the politicians, bureaucrats, corporate executives, media power brokers, and environmental exploiters who spend every waking minute thinking of new ways to fuck us over and rape the world we live in to make an extra buck. That pretty much says it.
Everyone is entitled, just by being alive, to certain basic rights. I mean, everyone has the right to shelter. Everyone has the right to healthcare, education, transportation.
We believe this, but
Yeah,
not everybody does.
Well, if you don't believe that, you're an asshole.
I know.
And like, I mean,
I know.
I mean, it's like, look, we don't live in Mali. If we lived in a dirt poor country, which, by the way, those countries have a lower disparity of income than we do here, right? But in the developing world. But if you live in a poor, like in Somalia, it could be said like, listen, we don't have the resources to help everybody, give everyone a living wage, guarantee housing and all that. We're just broke, okay? But that's not true in the U.S. 20 million empty homes in the U.S.
It's so much crazier in this concentrated little place called the Hamptons. Were your parents political in Ohio, or?
I am. So my mother is very political. Politics really do come from her. She's a good rabid left-winger, like me, flirted with, like basically tried to be a liberal Democrat, but it doesn't really generally take because, well, the Democrats aren't really that liberal anymore. But yeah, I remember I was 9 helping her campaign for McGovern and passing out literature and sitting next to her as she did phone calls for Jimmy Carter and all that stuff. So she protested the Vietnam War. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to say there's some exciting rebelliousness or story arc about my politics, but I've pretty much always been a lefty, except I've gotten more left as I've gotten older.
I got to hang out with Jules Pfeiffer.
I worshipped Jules. And then, like, we had a falling out. There's always, like, little feuds. And I'm sure, like, in the world of cobblers, there's, like, feuds. There's a feud, between me and Art Spiegelman. And he just felt like he needed to side with Art instead of just, like, staying out of it, which is the wise move. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, but there was no, obviously his work didn't run there, but there were some of his books in the back of one of my teacher's classrooms, and I found them. And I was like, here's politics about ordinary people instead of politics about politicians. I didn't even know that was possible in political cartooning. So that was the big takeaway for me. It was probably like 9 or 10. Yeah, it was like that and Doonesbury and, of course, Peanuts. And Mike Peters, the local political cartoonist, were my big 4 influences. And the big crisis of politics for me was probably during the 80s when I worked in banking. I was really convinced that before then that capitalism was this extremely efficient, although ruthless ideology. And I realized from working there and the people that I met that really that's not even true about the efficiency of
Darwin's natural selection efficiency, like that kind of thing?
I thought like the people who do this are business people are smart, they're cunning, they're they're motivated by the profit incentive above all else. And none of those things are true. They're really just like anybody else, and they're motivated by ego and their own like narrow biases. They're not just chasing the dollar, they're chasing their idea of what they think the world is really like, whether it really is or not. So you would see people just make kind of incredibly stupid decisions that made no sense. Look, there are people in business who are incredibly cool and incredibly progressive and incredibly interesting, but most of them, just like most people, are stupid. And like,
Somebody's finally admitted it.
Yeah, right. So, and I'm stupid in various ways. But it was kind of an awakening to me because, I always thought, well, socialism is this like pie in the sky ideology, but the one that really works ruthlessly in the real world is capitalism. And it's like, it doesn't really work very well, actually, at all. So there's lots of things that it fails at. Even in just, if you're just trying to line your pockets, it's not even really good at that. Like the boom bust cycle is kind of an example of that. If you keep your money in the stock market, you end up, it gains, then you lose it all, then you gain, you lose it all. I mean, someone figured out that if Donald Trump had taken the $2 million that his father gave him, which would now be $29 million adjusted for inflation, that if you just put it in an index fund, An index fund is boring beyond belief. Okay, it's in other words just like it just follows the market. But if he'd just done that, he'd be worth a lot more today than he is. So in other words, he worked for nothing. All those years he's been like staying late at the office. He never needed to even show up. He could have just stayed home.
And talk about somebody where profit is not the main motive, where his ego is. There's really something else going on there.
Right. Part of it is obviously, there's a desire. Some of it's not all negative. I mean, like you can imagine like this desire to build an empire, glorious empire with all these buildings that you think are beautiful. It's a human desire that people have had for forever. But it's also just like you have to, at a certain point, wonder like, if you die tomorrow, what if you left just a bunch of like brass trim and ugly looking buildings, right? I mean,
he's impossibly tacky. He's never gonna change.
He's gaudy and he's gauche and all those things.
You had that story that you saw his tax returns because
That's right, the Taj Mahal. I worked on the Taj Mahal project very briefly. He was trying to get money from a bunch of banks,
right? And
we were one of them. I'm pretty sure it was $25 million that he wanted at the time. Anyway, so he had to submit his taxes to us, even though he didn't submit them to the American people during the election. And so I went over them. My boss just had me look at them. I remember coming home and telling my girlfriend at the time, think about rich people is that they don't have any money. Like, rich people are poor. Like, rich people just have a lot of credit. But actually, if you had to cash out everything that rich people had and pay off all their debts, most of them are worth negative a lot. And Donald Trump was a classic example of that. There are exceptions. There are rich people who actually have cash, but not very many. They have credit. So I was like, wow, this guy's really not worth a thin dime. And he had a negative net worth for sure. It was just like all bluster. Well, but I'm Donald Trump, so it's kind of like I make magic beans. And I don't believe you make magic beans, Not to mention the idea for the project was idiotic anyway. And it did declare bankruptcy just a couple of years later.
And a friend of mine was working in New York doing the mock-ups for, I guess, the Trump Tower. He was working at an architectural firm that did the little models. And Trump was very upset that his building didn't look bigger than all the other buildings in the model. Well, he made them make his look bigger. First he said, is there any way we can make the other buildings smaller? And they said, no. And he goes, well, can you make mine bigger?
Of course you can. You can do anything you want, as long as the check's clear, which they may not have, knowing Donald Trump. I was just today writing my column this week. They figured everyone else is going to be talking about Comey. But I wanted to remind people that he campaigned as a different kind of candidate, that there was going to be this hodgepodge of populist left and populist right, a little bit of a dash of Bernie Sanders here. Remember, he promised an improvement on Obamacare, right? The health care was going to be better, cheaper.
We're going to keep all the good things.
No one's going to lose their coverage. And just on everything, even social issues for example, the bathroom law in North Carolina, right? He campaigned against the bathroom law. He said Caitlyn Jenner could use any bathroom that she wanted at Trump Tower. I was like, wow, that's very reasonable. He was against the Iraq War, but now he's bombing the shit out of Syria. He pulled back the regulations that allowed transgender students from using the bathroom of their choice in public schools. Just everything's been reversed. Everything has been totally hard right.
Which leads me to the theory that maybe it's like being there. He's just this empty thing. And whichever way he turns, he gets filled up with whoever's...
Oh, that's true. He's an empty vessel. I mean, look, they say personnel is policy. I mean, George W. Bush was a fairly moderate Republican before he became president. Then he let Dick Cheney appoint his cabinet, and look at what we got, a hard right-wing Bush administration. It's the same thing with Trump. The only people who were willing to work for him were the Steve Bannons of the world. Wow. They staffed it. And then that's what we get. I mean, they're all crazy, hardcore right-wingers. There's not even a centrist Republican in the bunch.
Okay, but enough about him.
Okay, originally I was just going to do the Snowden books just because no one else was doing it, and I was a little frustrated.
Are you still the only one who...
Yeah, there are no other Edward Snowden. There's a book that was kind of cobbled together from media reports that was done by Luke Harding from The Guardian. It's more about the leaks than it is about Snowden personally. You know, all these years I've been told, like, all you ever do is bitch and moan and complain. And so, you know, what should we do? People at my signings, people always say, like, you know, but what should we do? Never mind, like, what we shouldn't do. I'm a political cartoonist by nature, and it's such a negative medium that I'm not really used to being positive about anything. But I was like, here's a kid who did exactly what you're supposed to do when confronted with evil and wrongdoing. You're supposed to out it, even at great personal risk. And he did. And I was like, okay, well, so this story deserves to be elevated. And he had a really interesting arc because he was kind of a right-wing libertarian when he was a young man, and kind of like lost and floundering. And then he became this supercomputer genius, definitely a genius. Yeah, I wouldn't say he's today a left-winger. I don't think that's true at all. But he certainly had this big political awakening when he saw what U.S. foreign policy is really like, and how our rights are being violated every day. So Snowden was the first. That was in 2015. It came out 2 years after he did his leaks. Then Bernie,
I thought he had a chance.
he did have a
I was
chance.
so convinced. Well, yes, he did before the Democrats double-crossed him. Yeah, he did.
Yeah, they sure did. I mean, if they had just not put their thumbs on the scale. I mean, first of all, the superdelegate system is obscene. If you're going to have the superdelegate system at all, which you should not, Republicans deserve credit for not having it. What they should at least do is have a rule that prohibits anyone from expressing their allegiance or affiliation until the convention. But the fact that they announced all for Hillary except for like a few at the very beginning, it made that count always look at the very beginning. Like, it was weird. Bernie was winning all the primaries.
Yeah.
And then it was like, Hillary Clinton is ahead, 427 delegates to 12. And you're like, what the fuck? It's like the Democratic Party is still paying the price for that. I mean, like right now, I still don't think they have a prayer for 2020 because they haven't made nice with the Bernie people. The party is completely divided. And as insane as it sounds, I mean, I think Trump will be impeached by the Republicans. But I think as insane as it sounds, you're looking at President Paul Ryan in 2020.
Oh, no.
Unless the Democrats get their shit together, you know?
You predicted that, Trump, when you came to the library, and nobody believed it. You predicted he was going to win.
I wanted to be wrong.
Yeah.
But no, I had the advantage. I grew up in the Rust Belt. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I saw the yard signs. That's the thing about Donald Trump is he's the best presidential candidate of my lifetime. He's the best campaigner I've ever seen. I mean, because he was able to turn on a dime. Like, whenever he did something that didn't fly, he'd dump it immediately. Anything that worked, he repeated.
Maybe 50 words at his disposal.
True, not bad. But all the other members of the political class, like Hillary Clinton, she drove around the Rust Belt millions of times, right? She grew up in Illinois and Arkansas, so she knows what the middle of the country is like. But Trump was smart. He drove around. He's like, our airports are shitty, our trains are shitty, our highways are shitty, our inner cities are shitty, and he thinks, hey, you know, like, this is fucked up. We're a rich country. He didn't have a solution, but he pointed it out, and no one else ever did. That's why he's president.
So now you're on to the Pope. And this is the best Pope we've ever had, maybe.
Certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah. Did you see his TED Talk?
No, I haven't watched the TED.
There's the Pope calling for revolution. It's pretty amazing.
It's also fascinating considering that he's a product of the far right, you know.
I didn't know.
You know, during the Dirty War in Argentina, he was not on the side of the Angels.
Kidding.
He had very close ties to this regime militia called the right-wing junta called the Iron Guard. And he even, due to his neglect of failing to protect two of his priests who were Jesuits, they were abducted and tortured nearly to death because of his neglect, because his politics were so far to the right. And he has spent basically the rest of his life moving to the left and trying to atone for that.
Do you think?
He has said so many times. He has begged forgiveness from both of them personally. He celebrated a mass with them. He called for the church to open all of its records in Argentina so that anyone who participated in the dirty wars could be prosecuted. Church knows that the biggest area of growth of membership is in Latin America. So they wanted to do someone from Latin America, and they like the fact that he's ethnically Italian. He speaks Italian. Both of his parents are Italian. You know, that's obviously the culture of the Vatican. So there were a lot of things that sort of lined up. And then people talk about the Jesuit thing, but the truth is he was alienated from the Jesuit order at the time of his election because they were still pissed off at him over the dirty war thing. Doing what's right isn't supposed to necessarily be easy. So
That's right.
it's just right. Especially when he was meeting with Trump and he looked like he smelled poo.
And he did. I love those things going around that say, it's Melania in her veil, dress for the job you want, #widow. Those are wonderful.
Oh, man. You're not even allowed to say that. That's against the law.
You're not?
We're not allowed to threaten the life of the president. Federal law.
Are you allowed to joke about somebody else thinking about
Well,
the president
probably.
dying?
Probably. But just barely. I try to avoid all that.
Oh, shit. Did you win the LA Times lawsuit?
We're just at the events date to July, August of 2015. So back in 2001, I was arrested for jaywalking in LA.
I remember that.
And I wasn't jaywalking. And I filed a complaint.
Huh.
And the guy roughed me up.
What do you mean?
Well, he
Physically, really?
Physically, yeah, and he handcuffed me. So I filed a complaint with the LAPD. Nothing came of it. Never heard from him. So 14 years later,
Had no idea.
2015, I write a column for the LA Times that goes with my cartoon. It's just not even a column, it's a blog. There was a new jaywalking crackdown. So as part of my story, I talked about like what happened to me and how stupid this jaywalking law is, how it disproportionately targets people of color and working class people and so on. A few months later, I get a call from this reporter at the Times who told me that the LAPD was taking issue with my account and saying that it didn't really happen and that they had evidence that it didn't, that I was lying, namely an audio recording that the police officer secretly made that night in 2001, 14 years prior, of the jaywalking arrest. Listen to the recording, however, and there's nothing on it. You can't hear a thing. It's like...
So he could have just...
So he's like saying, well, this doesn't prove your story. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't prove their story either. It doesn't prove anything. Nevertheless, the Times not only fired me, but published a piece in the Times calling me a liar, which is, of course, career death for a journalist. A couple days later, I had the audio sent to an audio analysis company. They enhanced the recording and cleaned it up. And they found, like, you could hear people screaming at the cop in the background, take off his handcuffs, backing up my story. I sent this to the Times, and I really, truly assumed at this point I would be immediately brought back on. There would be a retraction. That would be the end of it. I couldn't imagine anything else, right? To me, it was a no-brainer. But they went silent. Obviously, they were scared to death. And when like me and other journalists started digging into it, we found out why, which was shortly before this all happened, the LAPD pension fund purchased controlling interest in the parent company, Tribune Publishing, of the LA Times. The LAPD owned the LA Times, literally owned it. I mean, obviously this should be illegal. No police department should be allowed to own a media organization. The shit hit the fan. There was like international media coverage. The Guardian covered it. The Association of American Editorial Cartoonists called for an investigation. And I thought, you know, at this point they were going to back down, but they doubled down instead. If they wanted to fire me as a favor to the police chief, all they had to do was just say, hey, Ted, we're moving in a different direction and we're not using you anymore. But they were determined to destroy me. It wasn't enough to fire me. They wanted to destroy my reputation so that I'd never work again. I mean, they were literally like trying to like drive me to suicide. I filed suit, and then the Times filed an anti-SLAPP motion against me, which is, for people who are unfamiliar with this, a SLAPP is defined as like a frivolous lawsuit that's filed by a deep-pocketed corporation in order to crush an individual. And
Who can't afford to fight them.
Right. So when you are a defendant in a case like that, as a poor person, you can file maybe an anti-SLAPP motion. They're abusing this law. This law was meant for people like me, not for big $500 million corporations like the LA Times. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to claim that I'm depriving them of their First Amendment right to free expression. Me, the cartoonist, who earned $300 a week. They have complete contempt, like for the system. And the thing is, they're assholes. All discovery is suspended. I can't move forward until a judge decides that I am likely to prevail in my lawsuit. The Times could have all sorts of stuff in their archives that would help me, but I can't get to it until anti-SLAPP is resolved. So it hobbles the plaintiff in a big way. On top of that, if the Times prevails, I will have to pay their legal fees. I'll be bankrupted, ruined, and my case is dismissed. So, and if they lose the anti-SLAPP motion, they can appeal. And they can try again, and they will.
And you said that every time you do a book signing, people come up to you and say, but Ted, what should we do? You kind of lay it out in this book.
The Anti-American Manifesto is just like, I don't know if, it's pretty hard to get something like that into print in the United States. So it's just amazing to me that, like, it exists. And I wrote the Anti-American Manifesto because I came to believe that the American system cannot be reformed. I mean, reform is always preferable to revolution if you can pull it off. If you get to the point where reform isn't possible, which I believe we're at, because the system is so ossified, there's so little class consciousness in the US, then it's just going to collapse. And I think you have to push for revolution because, it's like a boil. It's like it has to be lanced.
Because one of my favorite things in the book is you saying, I want you to lead the revolution by taking possession of yourself. And what do you mean by taking possession of yourself?
It means that you decide that you're going to start. It's a mental shift, I mean, everybody's had mental shift. You're in an abusive relationship and you just decide one day, I've had enough. You might not leave for 5 years, but the moment where you made that mental shift is when you started to get your way out the door. You've had a boss who mistreats you and you don't leave the next day, but that moment where you decide, like, I've had it, I'm going to look for something else, I'm going to make my move. And I think it's similarly when you just decide that this system, I'm done with this system. I'm no longer vested in it. Like, you have to live within it. You need to make as much money as possible, spend as little money as possible in order to survive. But it doesn't mean that you think it's a good system. You're not vested in it. You're waiting for the day that, like, you see people out in the streets with red flags so that you can go and join them.
Finally.
You're like, these are my people. I'm dropping everything. Let's go. So you're already ready in your heart. It's about that. It's about deciding that you're no longer going to buy into this garbage.
Right. You're already ready in your heart. So now when you look out, you see these opportunities.
I mean, I'm not a new agey kind of person, and I don't generally subscribe to that kind of rhetoric, but it's a little bit new agey because it is about the only freedom you really have is the freedom to think for yourself. And we rely as Americans entirely too much on, like, these systems, these checks and balances in the Constitution that we were propagandized as children over. Like Trump, he's out of control. He'll be impeached. Well, he'll be impeached if there's pressure from people on politicians, and politicians feel the heat. This is about, like, understanding how the world really is instead of trying to hope that it be something different. Like, it's like people who want revolutionary change and are completely anti-violence. Look, that's never going to happen. The rich and powerful have never ceded power voluntarily.
That's right.
I wouldn't.
The deep question is, are you willing to have less if everybody can have enough?
Once you agree that everyone should have enough, it only logically follows that everyone should have the same, because it doesn't make any sense that if there's sort of everyone's entitled to a certain base quality of life just for being a human being, then why should anyone be living a substantially better life than anyone else? Why should anyone have a better doctor or a better house or, why? All the metrics that capitalism uses to justify paying some people more than others really kind of don't even make sense within the construct of capitalism itself. For example, meritocracy. People who are smart deserve to earn more money than people who are dumb. If you've ever been with a group of 3-year-olds, you know that some kids are just born smarter than others. So are the ones who weren't lucky enough to be born smart Should they be condemned to a life of poverty and misery and cancer because of this like accident of birth? No, right? It makes no sense at all. That's even if you buy the idea that like being smart is what's going to make you get paid more. Then there's inheritance. Even the most virulent right-winger been able to justify inheritance as valid. If we're a meritocracy, well, it doesn't stand to reason that some people start the marathon on the 25-mile mark. And everyone else starts like at 0, right? I mean, Donald Trump, oh, he's a self-made man, except for the $29 million that he got from his parents. Look, wages are paid based on like what the market will bear. Unless you're voting for yourself. They vote on their own salaries in the boardroom. Hey, I'll vote for your raise if you vote for my raise.
How did you get to go to Afghanistan?
All you have to do is go to the embassy and to the consulate in New York and get a visa. So it's not like you need permission or anything like that. It's not hard to get in. Although the first time I went, it certainly was hard. It was during the war in 2001 in November. So what happened there was I was desperate to go. I'd been to Central Asia a number of times before, and I'd never gotten into Afghanistan proper, just barely inside.
Now, why were you desperate to go?
Because it was so unknown until that point. There were no major news organizations doing any kind of reasonable coverage from Taliban-era Afghanistan, and basically there was nothing decent. If you looked up anything that had been published about Afghanistan, it was usually from the 70s or the 60s. I mean, in the 80s is when the Soviets invaded. The war lasted throughout the 80s. Then in the 90s, there was the civil conflict, and everybody pulled out. There were almost no NGOs. So it was just this black hole of unknown.
But at the time that you went, there were already journalists embedded with...
No, embedding did not exist. Oh. Embedding was rolled out for the Iraq War and that program, but no, there was no embedding. So in September, October, well, I guess we knew the war was going to start pretty much after 9/11. Everyone who was an expert on Central Asia assumed we would attack Pakistan because Afghanistan really didn't have anything to do with 9/11. I guess they wanted to practice using their weapons against a defenseless population instead of a nuclear power. They went after Afghanistan, and I was going everywhere trying to get some media organization to send me in. But the politics had shifted so far to the right that no one wanted to send me. Finally, in November, I got the Village Voice to send me after they sent a bunch of sort of pro-military types to, but they couldn't get in. They, like my favorite, there were a bunch of guys who did the sort of the obvious thing. They went to Pakistan and they were waiting for the Khyber Pass to open. But whenever there's war there, they always close that border. My favorite was the guy who was somehow decided to go with the Navy and was sitting on an aircraft carrier. And I'm like, you do know Afghanistan is a landlocked country, right? That was not the best move, although he did get to watch cruise missiles being fired from the deck at Afghanistan. So anyway, The Voice sent me, and also my syndicate, and I was doing stuff for KFI Radio in Los Angeles. I cobbled the money together. You needed a lot of money to go back then.
And did your wife go with you?
She went, yeah. Wow. So did my agent. She wanted to go too. Yeah, so the two of them tagged me and two women, and we went to during the war. We went with a convoy of 45 journalists total. I mean, it's sort of ad hoc. It's more like we showed up at the hotel at the same time as these other people were going. We entered from Tajikistan, which was the way to go.
It's so many different things. It's part graphic novel, it's part a travelogue, part a history, and part a political rant. That's your publishers? They said...
They like what I do, yeah. I mean, it's about expressing yourself in an honest and forthright way, and I think, to my taste, way too many books are bound to a sort of very rigid genre, and they all sort of, I mean, even great books, they tend to be like, well, if it's a graphic novel, it's a graphic novel. Right. But the truth is that these stories are usually never so discrete. They're kind of intertwined, and it makes more sense sometimes to, especially when you're talking about something as complicated as Afghanistan, which is such a mess, and you need to come at it from so many different points of view. I mean, I could totally have played it straight and just done the straightforward reporting thing. I think it would have been dull, and it would have left too much on the table, just like not really sharing with the reader, not being honest.
Yeah. You've got a personal stake in it.
I mean, I met the foreign minister of the Taliban government at the time in Kabul, and I remember one of my favorite moments. We just went over a range of things, and finally he was like, well, do you have anything else you want to ask? And I said, yeah, I have a question about doctrine. I'm like, photography is haram, yeah? Forbidden. And he's like, yes. It's like, so what should happen to anyone who takes photographs? He's like, oh, they must be killed.
Okay.
And I'm like, killed. And he's like, killed, because it's an insult to the Prophet and to Allah. And I'm like, okay, so riddle me this. To come here, I had to file for a visa, yeah? And with my visa application, your embassy required me to submit 2 passport photos of myself, which is like the worst thing. Like a photo of a human being is the worst. And he's like, so? And I'm like, what do you mean so? You don't see the inconsistency? And he's like, there is no inconsistency. Of course there is. You're telling me that I should go out and make someone perform a sin that would require them to be killed. And in Islam, murder is wrong. To cause someone to sin is wrong. He goes, how are you to know what you look like? But he never saw the humor in it.
He didn't.
No. I get death threats a lot. A lot. A lot.
Okay.
In fact, I had a specific credible ISIS death threat last year.
And the death threats are because of the...
Right-wingers, ISIS.
But because of the political cartoons.
ISIS, yeah.
Okay.
And my writing. But ISIS is, they just hate cartoonists. Like the most pro-Muslim cartoonist ever. They should love me, but.
But I'm sure within their ranks they have jokes. I'm sure there
Oh,
are
I'm sure.
ISIS jokes, and they
Of course there are.
laugh and.
Of course. Yeah, they're people. Everyone has jokes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hope I don't have a ticket, so I have to go see your favorite judge.
That's this week's Phantom Hampton episode. If you want to hear more Phantom Hampton, you can find us on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Libsyn.